Welcome to the Word on Campus, where we take a behind-the-scenes look at how some of the best university podcasts get made. Alumni podcasts are a big part of the higher ed podcasting world, so we're going to be discussing another show focusing on the lives and stories of faculty, staff, and former students. Joining me today is John Boccacino, the Senior Internal Communications Specialist at Syracuse University, as well as the host and producer of the Cuse Conversations Podcast. As a passionate storyteller, John's career has focused on multimedia storytelling across multiple platforms. Let me say again. As a passionate storyteller, John's career has focused on creative multimedia storytelling across multiple platforms and mediums, and he's going to tell us more about his journey and how he got into podcasting. So, John, thanks for being here.
Robert, it's a pleasure. I know we had the pleasure of meeting in Denver at the Podcast Movement Conference, and I was struck by your passion. I was struck by what you're doing to spread the word about It's kind of meta when you have podcasters talking about podcasting, but I'm all for it.
Yeah, I love the meta concept, and I'll say, John, it was great seeing you there too. I always love your energy, and I'm sure your energy is going to come through really clear on this episode right here. So, all right, first place to start, John. Tell us a bit about your career path. So you moved from the news world into higher ed. What was that transition like, and how did you land at Syracuse?
Yeah, so for the listeners out there, I'm actually a 2-time degree holder from Syracuse. I got my undergraduate in broadcast journalism back in 2003. The best year on school history. We won the basketball championship with Carmelo Anthony. I was down there as a student in New Orleans, had so much fun watching and covering that team. I did a little bit of reporting. I worked for the student radio stations WJPZ and WAER. But I had my eyes on a sports journalism career, like a lot of kids who come to Syracuse do. And after graduating, I was a sports writer for Gannett, the Democrat and Chronicle here in Rochester. And I loved the industry, but it was the wrong time. They were laying off people. The industry was really shrinking upon itself. And I was unfortunately a casualty who got laid off by the newspaper industry. I have formed really good connections with higher ed communicators, and I did about 7 years in what's called sports information, which is promoting a school's teams and student athletes. And I did that for a state school, Brockport. I did that for a small private school, Cuse College. And I worked at Ithaca College with 27 sports. And I loved the experience, but I did not like the nights and weekends and the long hours. I mean, since I graduated, basically 13 years had been nights and weekends and working crazy shifts. So my alma mater came calling with a job in alumni engagement. That was just fascinating to me, getting a chance to engage with our 250,000 living alumni through profiles, through email sends, through event invitations, social media presence as well. And I did that for about 6 years. And then during that time, we had actually launched Cuse Conversations back in July of 2019, which I was so thrilled to get to be a part of that from the ground level. So my alma mater let me come back home and let me tell the stories of our alumni. And now I'm blessed to have expanded upon that to include the whole campus community along with alumni as well.
Yeah. And being an alum of Syracuse yourself, what do you think this adds to this show?
So I think what it really adds to it is it's a long-form storytelling platform that allows alumni to find out what the current students are up to, because we all know, I mean, whatever your school is, you wish them well, hopefully. You hope that they're able to be successful with academic pursuits, and if they have good sports teams, go far in their athletic pursuits as well. People want to know what the current generation is up to, and that's really what this podcast does. It started off as, hey, here's an alum success story. How did they get to where they are in life? What role did Syracuse play? What advice would they give to current students? And the episodes were fun. They were informative, but they kind of fell into like a pattern, if you will, of alum does thing. How did the alum do thing? And what would they tell future students to help them be successful? So what's cool about the podcast now is, and I had people at this podcast movement conference tell me that we should be focusing in the podcast more specifically. There should be one just telling student stories, just telling faculty, just telling staff, and just telling alumni. I disagree with that. I find that the holistic campus environment wants to know, the left hand wants to know what the right hand's doing. And that's what Cuse Conversations does. It pulls you behind the scenes to the great research that our faculty are achieving. I mean, we are what's called an R1 research institution by Carnegie, which means we are one of the most accomplished, decorated research institutions for higher ed in America. Our faculty were involved with gravitational waves, which is the very beginning of life. That's how everything started, with the Big Bang Theory and gravitational waves. We had faculty involved in that, and I had no idea about this until I started working at the university. And if I don't know about that, being a passionate, proud alum, we need to change that. So this is kind of what this podcast is all about. We do tell the great success stories of your name brand alumni. Like, I've talked to Bob Costas, I've talked to Marv Albert, I've talked to Super Bowl winning head coach Tom Coughlin. But we've also been telling the stories of first-generation college students, what it takes to go away from home, to find the resources to be successful. We are not just notable alumni. We are your everyday faculty and staff member who's really making a difference that you might not have heard of.
This is really special. I mean, this is one of the few shows, Cuse Conversations is one of the few shows that I've seen that works really well while still staying more general, right, and more far-reaching. I'm curious, in the making of this show, so was this your idea or was it someone else's idea on your team? How did it come to be?
So everyone on my team knows I'm a team player, but the podcast has been my baby. The podcast has really been a passion project for me. Going back to my days as a Gannett sports writer, I did a high school sports radio show on a weekly basis where we would go shine a light and feature kids who had never really spoken about themselves in the affirmative, had never been given a platform to talk about their accomplishments. And I love radio. I love, as you can tell, Robert, I have the gift of gab. I can talk a little bit. And the podcast was the perfect platform, for that. And I have to give a lot of credit. When I was in alumni engagement, I worked on a very talented team with two other former television folks, Kim Infanti and Chris Velarde, and they supported and allowed me to bring this podcast, to flesh it out, to come up with a plan of how we wanted to execute, how often we'd be posting, and make sure that there wasn't burnout involved as well. Kim has done one episode with us. She was the high level executive director. Chris has done a bunch of episodes. He still does produce content for us, even though I've now moved to Central Comms. He is one of our alumni voices that will host the podcast. But I've probably done 75% of the episodes, if not more, of the 153 that we've released out there. And it really is. It's my passion project, man. I love it. I love the platform. I love bringing people on who, these are organic conversations. We, outside of very, very sensitive topics, I don't share questions or topics ahead of time with the guests because I want to maintain that authenticity. I find that too often, if I were to give you a list of topics, then it's like a canned or a rehearsed conversation. And Cuse Conversations is anything but canned. It's very organic.
You're perfect for a show. This show is made for you.
I'm happy to join you, buddy. This has been it's fun. I love being on the podcast platform myself. It's fun to be on the other side of the equation for once.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about one of the episodes, right? So we asked you to recommend a few for us. You recommended two, so we're going to talk about one of them in more detail here. We're going to play a clip. So it's an episode that connects Syracuse with an alum who ends up with a role on the Apple TV Plus show Ted Lasso. Could you give us a brief overview of this episode and why you recommended it?
Yeah, so this episode to me, it was the perfect embodiment of you never know who has orange running in their blood. Max Osinski is a 2006 alumnus, and he was an actor. He had starred on Agents Marvel of S.H.I.E.L.D. He had been on a Walking Dead spinoff, but his real coming out party, if you will, as an actor was starring as a charismatic Zava on Ted Lasso. And, Ted Lasso was a feel-good show. It makes people believe, all sorts of really positive messages that we could use. Think about when Ted Lasso came out, it was during the height of the pandemic. And we all needed things to believe in, reasons to be optimistic. And so you've got this show that's really well established. And we find out heading into the third season that there's this guy, Max Osinski, who's one of us, who's an alum, and he's playing this guy who, if you watch the show, Zava, he's not in a lot of the scenes, but he steals the ones he's in. And he's charismatic, he's outgoing, but he never played soccer a minute in his life. So what I loved about the episode, we kind of go, and he actually almost turned down this role, which afterwards he was like, how dumb would I have been to say no to Jason Sudeikis and, being on Ted Lasso? But he was insecure. He's like, these guys, there's world-class soccer athletes who are on this show. There's actors who have gotten soccer training or played soccer. I don't even know the first thing about soccer. How am I going to convince these people that they want to have me on the show? And so he goes into, he was living in London at the time. He goes to these nearby parks and he gets really creative with up close slow motion video, so you can't see the form, but you can see the end result. You can see the ball spinning towards the net. You can see this guy who is chiseled working out in a park, and they're like, you look like a soccer player. You might not be a soccer player, but you look like one. And his confidence, it exudes throughout the episode. But what I loved about Max's story was, you've got this Hollywood guy who goes to Syracuse, our College of Visual and Performing Arts, to pursue a theater degree. He was actually born in a refugee camp in Poland. His parents had fled communist regime. They wanted to give their son a better life. And from these crazy, humble upbringings, you get this guy who is now a breakout star on Apple for starring as Zava on Ted Lasso. And his humility, he has never lost that. He's never lost that connection to what his refugee parents did. They left everything behind to bring him to America to pursue his dreams. How many people would say, you know what, we've left this atrocity-ridden country where we had to flee. You're going to study engineering. You're going to study medicine. You're going to become a lawyer. But his parents didn't. They said, whatever you want to do, if you have a plan, go out there and fulfill it. And I think that's so refreshing to let parents have their children go pursue their dreams, no matter how far-fetched they might seem.
We're going to take a listen to that clip right now. All right, so coming back here, John, how did you come up with this idea to interview Maximilian? And yeah, let's start there. How did you find him? How did you identify that this would be a good episode?
So it really wasn't a well-known fact that he was an alumnus. I mean, when it did come out, there was a quick story in one of the local newspapers that basically mentioned Max, but it didn't go into his story. And so my wife and I were watching episodes, and we love Ted Lasso, and it was like, I've got to reach out to this guy. So I took my shot. I reached out to him on Twitter, and he immediately responded and was like, here's my Gmail address, hit me up there. And so we started this conversation. And I'm telling you, Robert, it wasn't like he goes, hey, talk to my agent. My agent will find time in my calendar. He was responding 10 minutes after my inquiry and saying, oh my gosh, I love Syracuse. I'd love to come on and share my story. And what I found fascinating was, so there's people at Syracuse who knew of him, but he didn't really have an established pipeline of connections. He wasn't really viewed as someone who was a notable alumnus. This podcast conversation has opened up so many doors to get his involvement back with his alma mater. I'll give you a great example of it. So our men's soccer team, for the first time in school history, won a national championship last year. They beat Indiana, thrilling game in PKs, and our soccer coach, Ian McIntyre, is a huge Ted Lasso fan. There are plans in the works to have Max and his family come back to campus to give him a Syracuse orange Zava jersey and welcome him back into the family. And I'm like, that is so cool. This humble beginning, this outreach on Twitter or X has led to a lifelong affinity where Max is going to be forever engaged and forever orange. And I just love that. That's the power of this podcast. It gives you the warm and fuzzies about your alma mater, and people feel like a good connection, and they can now understand that whenever they watch Ted Lasso, one of us is starring as Zava.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, he is a Syracuse soccer player. Honorary Syracuse soccer player.
Yeah, maybe he can
amazing.
take a kick during PKs of one of their big preseason games, and he has no eligibility left for college, unfortunately. But that relationship is so cool, and that's one of those things where. So I know you and I have gone through discussing like metrics and how people track episode success. I'll give our listeners here a little background on our pod. We get between 300 and 500 listens and downloads per episode, which I know is far below the true crime podcasts and the ones who are out there really crushing it with their engagement. But we're not out there to make money. We're not out there to profit off of our podcast. We have 300 to 500 people on average listening to our episodes. When Max's episode was posted on social, we use little video snippets, if the circumstances allow, to let people see the person and hear in their words and kind of do a little teaser for the episode. And we use that frame of Max potentially turning down this appearance and then what made him change his mind and how he won over the cast to land this role. And it just exploded on social media. I mean, when we factor the success of an episode, we do take listens, we do take downloads, we do take the amount of time someone spends listening to an episode. But the social media engagement, our post went nuts. I mean, the impressions were crazy. We're talking about, almost 100,000 people saw that post, clicked on the podcast series, watched the video teaser, and even if they didn't listen to the whole episode, we got them hooked. And we feel that what makes our episodes so strong is the audience is sticky. We could buy audience members, but the people we have are diehards and they want to listen to the episodes. And I'll tell you one more little humble brag about the pod, if you will.
Please.
So attention spans are shorter than ever. I mean, people tune out from a YouTube video after like 3 to 5 seconds if it doesn't hold their attention. We have almost 70% of our audience retained all the way through an episode. And our episodes are 25 to 45 minutes in length. If you get 300 to 500 people and 70% of them check out an entire episode, that to me is worth more than if we had 10,000 people listening to an episode, because it's an engaged audience that we are delivering the messaging that's really hitting the mark.
Absolutely. When you pick guests, what criteria do you have?
So I'm glad you brought that up. It's a collaborative spirit, and I'll let you know. We have meetings with my team and I where now it's me, myself, and I producing the episodes, but I keep my bosses in the loop. We have a content calendar, and we try to frame episodes based on current events. So I mentioned Zava, when his dropped, the season 3 finale of Ted Lasso had dropped, so it was kind of a logical tie-in to the end of the show. In America, DEIA efforts are under attack on college campuses. And we had this big symposium on DEIA efforts at Syracuse, where we actually previewed the symposium by bringing on our Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion to talk about the Supreme Court rulings, ending race-based admissions processes, and what we were doing to really reach out and let students know that, they don't have to worry, we're still going to have their back when it comes to providing a welcoming atmosphere. We try to be tie-in friendly to current events happening on campus. I mean, look, if there's something that's crazy cool, yeah, we'll tell that story too, but we want to give you a reason for listening, not just doing an episode because we can do it, but make it a tangible tie-in and a tangible takeaway. And we have a content calendar that I actually have mapped out a design of episodes all the way through June for our... We go 2 or 3 times a month. So it's important to really think about this and also spread the love around too. There's 13 schools and colleges within Syracuse. And thanks to great relationships with the communicators who run those schools and colleges, we make sure that we get balance. So it's not always going back to the broadcast journalism well, which is one of our most famous programs. We want to tell the architecture success stories. We want to tell engineering success stories, the teacher stories out there too. It's really a cross section. It's very diverse, and I couldn't be prouder of that.
So you talked a little bit about this content calendar and then the fact that the audience, right, is really sticky. I'm curious, in the years of doing this podcast, have you seen like certain themes attract like more people than other themes?
Yes, I absolutely have, and I'll give you a really good example of this. So you would think that the most popular or most downloaded episodes, like, listen, we had our football coach on for Father's Day talking about the impact that he had as he was a father of 3 children, and he's viewed as the father of the football team. And that episode did really well. But we also had on 2 student leaders who put forth our AAPI Heritage Month activities. And you would think, oh, 2 students, what notoriety is this going to get? It exploded in popularity because people love to hear the passion of what students are up to. And I think that's really the lifeblood of any university. So every chance I get, whether it's first-generation students, whether it's students of diverse backgrounds talking about how they're making a difference on campus. We even had, there's this one student, I have to give him a shout out. His name is Thomas Wilson. He's a special needs student who was part of our Inclusive U program at the School of Education. And Thomas is a little mini celebrity on campus. He graduated this past May, but he's special needs in an area that really has not been given a platform to do broadcast journalism. And yet Thomas was on the student-run TV stations doing his Thomas on the Town segments, interviewing the chancellor, interviewing the head of facilities, just doing these really cool human interest stories. We had him on the podcast, and he is one of a few guests we've had. There haven't been many where the entire audience, 100% of them, made it through his 25-minute episode. If you had told me that a student of his background was going to be one of the few to reach 100%, I wouldn't have thought it possible. But it goes to show people latch onto those captivating stories, and I'm really proud of that one too.
That's amazing. 100%. That's another humble brag.
100%. Nobody I was stunned because I kept looking through Spotify's metrics, and it literally showed me the entire audience was all the way across. There wasn't a dip. There wasn't a valley. It was consistent across the board. And I told Thomas that after the fact, and he started crying. And it was just so touching because he bleeds orange. He loves this school. And the fact that the community picked him up and listened to his story. Sorry. The fact that they listened to his story was just, it was touching.
How do you think Cuse Conversations impacts kind of external perception of the university? So we talked about internal and current students and alum, but what about external?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would like to think that we have a market with external audiences, and it wouldn't be natural at first because you're thinking to yourself, well, this podcast clearly, you look at our branding, it's all Syracuse. There's a Block S logo. Every font type is orange, white, and blue. It's clearly evident that you're listening to a Syracuse University podcast. But I think what really resonates with the external audience is these are success stories in general that can apply whatever your affinity. And I'll give you a great example. So the first week of October was Mental Health Awareness Week. And we had on our counseling director, Carrie Brown, to share tips on isolation, loneliness, making friends, and finding community. I don't care if you go to Syracuse or not. Every one of us has had those moments of insecurity where it's like, do I have a good friend circle? I'm feeling nervous or anxious. How do I deal with this? And this is somebody who is a staff member who was sharing these best practices. That's something that can resonate with any audience, regardless of what school you happen to go to. We try to find those examples. The Father's Day one, too, with Dino Babers. Yes, he's our football coach, but every new father has gone through what Dino has gone through in welcoming in a child and wondering if you're capable enough of raising this young, small, developing human to be a good person in this world. And so that's where our audience is totally Syracuse affinities, but we think we resonate pretty well outside of that circle too.
Does Cuse Conversations work with other podcasts on campus? So what I'm thinking about is, when we talk about these this variety of topics that are covered on the show, it's intentionally this way. And intentionally not, choosing to focus on smaller shows or different shows. So, do you guys work? Yeah, do you guys work with other shows on campus or no?
Yeah, so it's one of the projects I've taken on of trying to expand upon this because there's a couple we've worked with, but we really haven't done as much as we should. And I feel like Cuse Conversations is the flagship podcast for Syracuse University, but we have a podcast solely for the graduate students. We have one with our Environmental Science and Forestry School, which is a SUNY partnership. Athletics does podcasts. Syracuse Abroad, our study abroad program, has a podcast. And what I want to do is really form these partnerships where we can cross-promote each other. We learn this the best in Denver at Podcast Movement. The podcasts that have the similarities that work together to offer, pre-roll or mid-roll spots promoting each other, that's how you find that community. That's how you cultivate new listeners. And I'd be more than happy to welcome on any other member, whether it's, again, the Campus Conversations or the Soundbeat, which our libraries does, which is awesome. Robert, they pull off some of these cool, they've got such living archives at the Belfer Audio Library here on campus, and they pull out these little snippets of audio interviews from 50 years ago. We had an alumnus, Don Waffle, who was a class of 39, who passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a decorated veteran. And so for Veterans Day, they rolled out these different interviews, kind of telling this life of someone who had made it to almost 100 years old and had seen his life has changed. And imagine the changes. Imagine if you're born, 100 years ago, how much technology has changed, how much life has changed. And they kind of told that story through these little audio snippets. I really want to make Cuse Conversations be a collaborative partner where we look out for each other, because if we don't, who else will?
And what do you think the biggest challenge to that is?
I think the biggest challenge is just getting the buy-in. Podcast itself is so siloed that you might think, well, why would I want to share, give John from Cuse Conversations 30 seconds to talk about an upcoming episode? But the challenge turns into an opportunity, because if we work well together, we can, just because I have an audience and you have an audience, why can't we share and build together? My audience can become yours and vice versa. If, again, you've got that underlying connection of Syracuse, being the tie that bonds us all.
Gotcha. All right, and this connects to my last question here, right? You kind of get a little sneak peek, but what are you looking forward to that's coming up on the show?
So we've got some incredible conversations. I never rest, as you can tell, when it comes to this topic out here. I'm always mapping out content calendar ideas and who we can bring on. As a basketball fan, I am stoked that Adrian Autry, our first-year head coach, is going to be our next episode we release. Adrian's a 1994 alumnus. He took over for a living legend, Jim Boeheim, who had coached for 47 years at Syracuse. And Adrian's finally getting his due. The season starts off coming up in a couple of weeks, so he's going to be one of the ones coming up soon. We've got Native Heritage Month in November. There's a woman, Lorna Rose, who is a 2-time degree recipient, who is so proud of her Native heritage. She got a law degree. She's a communications professional. She also has overcome a bunch of disabilities in her life. She doesn't let those disabilities define her. She lets her heritage really define her and her passions for communications and storytelling. She's coming up in November. We've got a research-themed one with Duncan Brown, who's our vice president for research. Again, I mentioned the R1 label as a research institution. He's going to pull the curtain back on how we've built up this reputation as being a worldwide leader in research. So I'm really excited for that one. And then there's one I have to mention this earlier, because in April, it's one of these. So Robert, I'm not sure how you were as a college student. I'm not afraid to admit I like to party a little bit at college. I like to have a beer or two and have a good time in the social scene. Some people go overboard, and some people have addictions that come from partying and the partying lifestyle. So April is Alcohol Awareness Month, and we've got an alumnus, Earl Murphy, who was actually my year at Syracuse, 2003. He admits he partied way too hard, he hit rock bottom, and checked himself into rehab. He's going to come on to talk about his partnership with Syracuse University's Health Center to come up with resources for students who might find themselves slipping down that path of becoming an alcoholic, how they can stop, how they can get help, what the university is doing for them, and what he's doing as a valuable resource. And to me, that perfectly summarizes the tie-ins between here's an alumnus who learned a valuable lesson that we all can pick something up from, and what he's offering to the current student population. That's going to be in April, and I couldn't be more excited to tell his story, because how many people are willing to put themselves in that vulnerability and admit that I was an alcoholic. I couldn't handle my partying. I needed help. I want to help people who are in the same boat that I was in back then.
That's amazing. You have some very meaningful stories coming up. So, okay, there's some in November, and we'll keep out for that one in April. Right.
Please do. I mean, honestly, and I know, Robert, your audience isn't Syracuse affinity folks, but, we're friendly with Cuse Conversations here. We always want to hear from our audience. You can find us on all your major podcasting platforms by searching for Cuse Conversations. We have a website, news.syr.edu/podcast. And I want to mention one other thing that is in the works to hopefully happen at some point in the next 6 months or so. I don't know about you, but I really want to take Cuse Conversations live. We're launching a YouTube channel, and what I envision for some goals down the road are live podcasts where you can tune in on YouTube. You can watch me or the other hosts talking to a guest. You can ask your questions through a moderated chat panel and feel that engagement, because that's really the one thing I think is missing from our podcast. Besides the great social engagement, it's not a two-way street. And I want to make the live YouTube podcast episodes be that. And maybe one day we actually have them in person, where we take this on the road and go to a different city across the country and have a live Cuse Conversations. But for the meantime, YouTube seems like a really cool solution to bring our audience up close and personal with Cuse Conversations.
We'll have to do a part 2 after the live Cuse Conversations goes live. That'll be really exciting to see.
I appreciate your support, my friend.
Always. I'll always support. This has been John Boccacino from Cuse Conversations over at Syracuse University. John, thank you so much for coming on.
Anytime, my friend. Anytime you want me back, I'm happy to come on talking about the passion project of podcasting. And you do a great job with your podcast too. Don't be too give yourself some praise, because I think what you're doing, there aren't a lot of us that are doing the higher ed podcasts like this. There need to be more. And my last thing I'll tell you is I feel like the podcast market might be saturated in general, but I feel one of the last untapped avenues of podcasting is higher education podcasts. So everything you do to let us come on and share what we are doing, we're a tight-knit community, and it means everything to have your support.
All I have to say is thank you. I really appreciate it. So with that, let's end on a good note. Thanks again, John.
My pleasure. Keep up the great work.